Why speak so fast, man? What's up with that?
Fact. The criticism that most commonly gets deployed at me in relation to speaking fast somehow being unfair against ESL speakers largely comes from EPL men. And it's always been very interesting to me to hear EPL men tell me repeatedly that speaking fast somehow marginalizes ESL speakers, when meanwhile, the best ESL teams in the world have beat the shit out of me repeatedly by not talking fast, but deploying a variety of strategies. This was really quite emotionally crushing for me because I'd invested a lot of time in improving at debate. And I also thought I was better than I was at because I have a respect, even if I don't agree strategically with many of the choices that these teams make. I have a respect for teams that are willing to go hard and go all out with their own unique style, even when I think it's batshit insane.
Okay, Matt, welcome to the podcast. Um, Best speaker in the world 2021, world semifinalist, winner of Oxford IV. How do you feel?
2022, not 2021. 2021 was 10, but feeling pretty good. Good to be with you, Nikki.
Yeah, we already started with me not being the debate nerd that we all need, but I have to ask the tough questions from the beginning.
Go for it.
Why speak so fast, man? What's up with that?
Oh my God. Well, there's a few reasons. I guess the first is that strategically, I found it to fit really well with what I wanted to accomplish in debating starting out. It wasn't a natural choice, more something that evolved stylistically over time. So uh, I don't think I had this reputation, at least to begin with, on the North American circuit. Rather, I think it grew organically over time in the online era. And arguably, I shouldn't have leaned into it because it's become a meme that's far larger than life now. But at the time, when debating against a lot of speakers who had, specific rhetorical flair or specific stylistic strategy that they attempted to employ, speaking quickly allowed me to deliver more content than a lot of other speakers on the circuit. And in delivering more content, it was, at least initially, a means by which I was able to score some wins against these much better debaters. And over time, I like to think I've modulated it at least slightly. But at some point, the legend got away from me, and now it's a meme that's arguably far larger than me at this point. So we can quibble about whether or not I should have leaned into it, but I leaned into it indeed, or at least the community believes I did.
So obviously, like we get the idea of you say more stuff, there's more content, but if other people try to just speak fast, probably won't work as well. What's the secret?
What's the secret? Okay. Um, I think that a lot of people, when attempting to sort of emulate the style of debate that I've, for better or for worse, become known for, they make the mistake of confusing saying many words with saying a lot of things. And what I mean by this is often people think that just throwing a lot of content at the wall and hoping that it sticks is inherently a good strategy. And I certainly started out this way, at least when I began debating. There are plenty of bad speeches I've given that are, just me rattling off a ton of mechanisms and examples and then finishing very abruptly. But what I think people lose sight of when attempting to emulate this is they end up doing that rather than working on two of the things that I felt were some of the hardest things I had to conquer in debating from the beginning. One of which was word economy, and the other one was sort of control and command over the language. So, in terms of word economy, what this looks like is figuring out ways to say complicated things more quickly, ways to condense long explanations of mechanisms into fewer words, and ways to, generally find shortcuts to explain various arguments that judges will sort of intuit and understand fairly quickly. The second thing was just command of the language. And what I mean by this isn't like speaking English clearly, but I mean articulating clearly. So, like in terms of diction and tone and things like this, making sure that you're able to be understood by a judge. Because if you're just speaking very, very, very rapidly with absolutely no variation, people are going to have a far harder time tracking you. But if you vary it up over time, or even if you don't vary it up, at the very least you enunciate very clearly on every word, then it's easier to follow. At least those were the things that correlated with my success. And it wasn't easy. It was something I had to work at for a long time.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but what is a good example of when you think about your process of learning how to do good word economy and be efficient in that particular type of um, choosing the correct wording for certain types of things?
Sure. Yeah. Well, if you want to see an example of me doing it badly, one pretty famous speech is me in the KCL Open Finals in 2021. I don't think it's a bad speech. There are certainly worse speeches of mine recorded online. We can talk about that in a minute. But in that speech, I take a very, very long time to say something very basic. For those who don't know, the motion was essentially about giving prisoners democratic rights within prisons. And one of the arguments I'm making is that this essentially ends the prison industrial complex as it exists in the Western world today. I take a very, very long time to essentially say that prison today is modern slavery. I could have said that in those 4 or 5 words. Instead, I spend about, like, I don't know, 6 or 7 sentences with very, very long words trying to explain this concept. And it works out okay. We win the debate. But I could have said this much more briefly. And when I was showing it to a friend of mine, Yossi Moskovich, who's a Euros DCA, who's ESL speaker, he was like, Matt, you could have just said all of this by saying prison is modern day slavery in about one line, and it would have conveyed the same exact thing with more emotional weight than what you said. And I was like, makes sense. So I think an example of me doing this better, or at least internalizing this a bit better, would probably be my Belgrade Worlds rounds. So round 5 and round 7 in particular, where I'm extending one off of Rumen and Alec in round 5, and once off of Sharia and Ted. So LSEB in round 7. And both of those rounds, I'm still talking more quickly than a lot of debaters do. But what I'm doing that's distinct from previous rounds or rounds in previous years is it's all serving one cohesive case with a couple of key taglines sort of embedded at the start and finish to make it kind of all congeal into one cohesive whole rather than it being, just a bunch of word salad, for lack of a better word.
While you're developing this style of yours, um, who are the inspirations in the process in terms of speakers or maybe even non-debaters?
No non-debaters, but primarily when I was sort of developing more competitively, I was primarily seeking to emulate speakers like Tin Pliuch and Naomi Panovka, because those were the speakers I sparred against most regularly and online, who have similar but distinct styles of debating. And so a lot of my efforts, at least early on, was to emulate those speakers in terms of both the amount of content they're able to produce, but also word economy as well. So those were the initial inspirations. There are definitely more speakers that I've attempted to emulate for better or for worse, but that was the origination of sort of the matter dumping style. Reece Steele is another one from Manchester Advanced Trainings.
Did you attempt to adapt your style during major competitions in terms
Very,
of,
you know,
yeah, I mean, you get the
yeah,
question.
very, very much. So I think initially I wasn't aware of how much a name for myself I had made for the whole speaking fast thing. I think I was just doing my thing, and then the feedback I was receiving from speakers, but also the general perception I was discovering in the community, sort of became one that I was someone who talked very very fast, and this was not something I had set out to do initially, but more had happened as a consequence of me attempting to develop other skills. So I didn't set out to speak at lightning fast speeds. I set out to say a lot of content so that, teams trying to extend off of me would have a harder time extending, and teams attempting to respond would have to take down many, many mechanisms in order to win and to overcome the challenges I was forwarding from prime minister or leader of opposition. So the fast talking sort of happened as a byproduct of this, as did the community perception. So in the lead up to majors, particularly Belgrade Worlds, Madrid Worlds, but mostly Belgrade, especially as debating transitioned from online back to in person, which, I mean, I'm sure we can talk more about this as we go on. I felt the need, especially in an in person environment, which is, I think, different both in terms of the way people evaluate debates, but also the way speeches are perceived, even in a vacuum, to modulate my style. I think fairly, not significantly. It's still, I think there's a through line through all of my speeches, but significantly enough that there are distinctions between the in-person speeches and the online ones. I don't know. I can talk more about that if you want, but we can start wherever you'd like.
Yeah, yeah, tell me more about this. I think it's interesting because what I'm trying to kind of show the audience is that while your speaking style seems to be very simple and it gets on a lot of people's edges, there is a lot more thought and work behind it than it might seem at first.
Yeah, yeah. So in terms of prepping for majors, I never had a chance to speak Korea Worlds. That was not something I was going to be able to do logistically. I only started my master's at LSE in the fall of that year, so following the Summer Worlds. But I did do the Korea prep season, and I also did the Belgrade prep season in the lead up to this. So, in terms of sort of preparing initially, a lot of what I was attempting to learn to do was to as I spoke about earlier, control word economy, speak in such a way that was able to be conveyed like reasonably clearly to judges, even if I was talking quickly, and also to ensure that fundamentals of debate were still strong, things like this. So making the correct arguments, being persuasive, these kinds of things. Um, as debate transitioned into offline, this sort of correlated with a degree of community criticism, which largely was what you said. Why do you talk so fast, bro? So as this became more and more loud from more and more corners of the community, I realized I would have to modulate my style at least somewhat, or I wasn't going to win as frequently as I would like because it became too known as a problem. And we can talk about this more in a bit because I have thoughts on this as well. But as it became something that more and more people talked about, and more people had thoughts on, I realized I would have to change these things up. Also, the shift to in person made a big difference in that once I moved to in person debating, it adds a different dimension to the game that doesn't necessarily exist in online. Not that speeches become less powerful necessarily in person that are analytical, but it's like other styles get supercharged by the in person environment. So if you're very persuasive with body language or rhetorics, it doesn't come across as clearly on Zoom as it necessarily does at an in person competition. So as these other styles get like significantly more powerful, you need to vary yourself. You need to branch out more. You can't just be an analysis machine, or you're going to lose rounds you wouldn't lose in an online environment, even if you think that judges are judging incorrectly or they're over crediting rhetoric. It's sort of beyond the point, right? Because we're human beings, we're not robots, and style matters more in person than it does online, and it's credited more in person than it does online. So for me, one of the big things I had to learn to do in person was relearn some of the in-person debating skills I developed prior to online debating, like very basic things: make eye contact with the judge, slow down at critical points like your impact, so you're able to make the point come across clearly. Be very, very careful about word choice, so your mechanisms sound clear and don't bleed into one another. Take pauses and breaths between specific content sections so it gives time for judges to recover. These were things I started to pay more close attention to. And I think was eventually rewarded for it with the previous Worlds performance and the tournament season leading up to it.
So how much of the community's criticism is justified and how much is not?
I've been waiting to answer this for a very long time. Um, so thank you for giving me the opportunity to do it. So I think that when talking about community criticism, you can break it down into two main categories. The first is a criticism that's based on fairness, which goes something like BP is a game, and it's a game that people, play for fun and for competitive success. And talking very, very quickly as a strategy is somehow competitively unfair, either because it disadvantages ESL speakers who might not be able to track or follow the fast words as well, or because it disadvantages closing teams because closing teams won't have enough to say when a very fast talking speaker who dumps a lot of material says all of the arguments in OG and then CG has very little to say, for example, or for another reason, because it marginalizes specific types of niche strategies that might be good to have around in BP. And then the second criticism is sort of a pedagogical one, which is basically BP is a game, sure, but it's also meant to be a learning experience for university students. And talking very, very fast sort of makes that aspect of the game less important. And in making that aspect of the game less important, it sort of devalues that element and makes it less powerful of a learning tool for students who are attempting to learn how to public speak and then cross apply that public speaking skill in the real world in a job or something like this. Do you think I fairly represented the criticism here? Would you have anything to add there, or is that more or less what you think the criticism boils down
I'm not a hater, man. I don't know what you want me to say. I
to?
don't have any problem with it, but I'll tell you my side of the story a little bit later. So continue with the interesting part.
Cool. So I think that broadly boils down the criticisms I've heard. Some of them are, worded differently, but largely I think that covers it. Uh, Responding to them in turn, I think in terms of the competitive aspect of it. So is talking quickly and matter dumping a fair strategy or not? I think this one is a bit overblown. And I think the reason it's a bit overblown is understandable, right? If you are fairly new to BP or even moderately experienced, you come into an activity and somebody's talking very, very quickly at you, it doesn't sound particularly nice necessarily if you're not used to it. And you might not be able to listen to it particularly well, especially if you're unused to it. It's worth noting here that I think even slow debaters are considered very, very fast by an average listener. So when I play speeches for family and friends, they'll often say even speakers like Rumen are fast. I've never heard any speaker say you're fast, but I've heard in general people think that debaters talk quickly. So I can understand where this criticism comes from. But I think as a criticism, it's misplaced for, I think, a few broad reasons. The first is that I think talking fast is sort of a solved strategy in a way. And what I mean by this is that if you're going to dump a lot of matter, you necessarily trade off against some other skills. Nothing in debate is, wholly beneficial. Every style has benefits and drawbacks, and every path you choose in a debate necessarily involves sacrificing other things. Everything in a debate, from the moment you start prep and you figure out what the opposition team is going to say and you figure out what to trade off, is a sacrifice. The trick is making a sacrifice effectively. And fast talking carries a big sacrifice, and that's clarity and it's also depth of argumentation. If you're going to talk very fast in 7 minutes, you necessarily trade off some degree of clarity and depth in argumentation. And if you trade off that clarity and depth in argumentation, it makes it easier for other teams to just, belittle things you say and say, they said a lot of things, but actually it's not really that important, and here's why. And then explain one argument in depth that outweigh it. Or if you're extending, it's very easy to be like, they explained this at a superficial level, but in fact, I can explain this a lot deeper and go a lot more into the argument. Both of these strategies have been employed against me, against other matter dumping, fast talking speakers to very good effect for the past 3-4 years of BP debating. And they're not strategies that are poorly positioned against fast talking either. If you want evidence of this, the recent World semifinal where I speak against Tel Aviv A and Ateneo A, I'm opening opposition. We do not advance. The two other teams go through on long diagonal. You can quibble all you want about how you feel about the verdict of the round, but ultimately what happened was is we lost. We failed to convince the panel, and I think that that arguably proves that there are ways you can beat fast talking without talking fast yourself and without responding to every single argument or engaging in other practices you don't necessarily want to. So as far as that goes, I do think there are ways to beat it. Now, yes, obviously, if you talk really, really quickly, you'll have an advantage in some facets of the game. And if you explain a lot of arguments, in some rounds it will reward you and you will win more by matter dumping. It's a skill that if you practice a lot and develop very well, you can reap very big rewards by doing it well. I don't even think I'm the most successful debater who has employed a matter dumping strategy, but you can definitely be rewarded for it. But there are ways, if you want to beat it, that you can beat it without becoming it. So I think this aspect of the criticism is somewhat overblown. I would also say that to an extent, there are other trends in debating that have exacerbated this problem that don't have to do with fast talking. One of which is, I think, a tendency for teams for judges rather, to place a much higher burden analytically on back half teams than they did when I started out. What I mean by this is that there's a much higher burden for explicit weighing against your front half than there used to be in BP debating. I started debating in 2017. We can talk about that later. But in 2017, you didn't have to weigh explicitly against your front half. If a judge qualitatively saw your argument was better, you would, you would win, even if you didn't do explicit weighing. In fact, weighing explicitly against your opening in a very sort of rebuttal-y way was considered kind of ungentlemanly. It wasn't something you did very often. So this was one trend. The other trend is, I think, moving towards motions that, while they might have depth, tend to have more vertical depth than horizontal depth. This is something I've noticed to be very common in major tournaments recently. And what I mean by this is that while motions haven't necessarily gotten shallower in across the board, what they have become is they've become more analytical in nature, where both teams on Gov and both teams on Op are making broadly the same arguments, but they're making them analytically distinct ways. And this is a sort of motion type that benefits matter dumping a lot, because if you can run the analysis better than your closing can run distinct and parallel mechanisms that are, just weaker than yours, and so you will lose them if you dump a lot of matter and then the team tries to extend and they fail. So this, I think, exacerbates like this sort of perceived problem with matter dumping more than it actually is. So I don't think, as far as fairness goes, it's a major problem. I can talk about the pedagogical criticism now, but did you have anything you wanted to say about that? Or
I have two important things to say, and I'll play the ESL card. I'm ESL, so I wanna kind of talk over a little bit on that criticism. Number one, matter dumping is a strategy in debating. It is not uh, speaking, fasting, or whatever. It's a strategy that many speakers, not only you, have used both ESL, EPL, and EFL. If you want to count Rumen as an EFL speaker, he's the two-time best EFL speaker in the world. But it is a strategy that multiple debaters have deployed. It is a strategy that Tin, for example, has deployed, becoming best speaker in the world as an ESL person. I'm not gonna go into that, but the point is, it is a strategic choice that in certain cases people make. It has nothing to do with whether you can or you can't speak fast in particular. In fact, it is sometimes something that I've talked over with Roman as a strategy that there are certain rounds when he has to mentally prepare himself that he's going to speak much faster than usual because we need more content in that speech. I need more content in that speech in order to do other things in mine. So it's an active choice that you make, and it's something that you can do. So it's not dependent on the style that you're talking for. In fact, I'll give another example that people might want to think about. Ruman's 90 speech was in no way as fast as your fastest speeches, but it was definitely not a slow one by any criteria, including debate criteria, slowness that I can point to. In fact, my 89 speech was, in comparison to my speeches, quite fast. So what I'm trying to get at is this sometimes is something that you need to do in debate rounds where you wanna and you need to say a bunch of stuff, and it has nothing to do with you using an unfair advantage against people. It is something that everybody can do if they want to. It's practicable on its own, so that's important to be said. Second thing that I will say, you're absolutely correct that you can, on the other side of this, if you feel like it's unfair towards you, to take advantage of it in certain types of ways. So I am not as fast as you. I can never make as fast of a speech, but there are multiple strategies that I've deployed against you. Some of them you mentioned. Others come down to just strategically figuring out what's important in the round and spending more time on it as compared to other stuff. So I'm not actively responding to everything you say, but I'm picking particular parts of your speech and attacking them and convincing the judge that if I win on those particular parts, I'm winning the round. Sometimes it has worked, sometimes it hasn't. What I'm trying to say is that, in my opinion and my perspective, when we faced each other, it has 99% of the time come down to strategic choices that we make as compared to who spoke fast or who spoke
Yeah.
slow, meaning that it is very subjective, the style on its own, and it's much more about the content behind it.
I completely agree. And I think I would add on to this that the ESL criticism in particular, interestingly enough, has almost never been leveled at me by ESL speakers to my memory. It, in fact, the criticism that most commonly gets deployed at me in relation to speaking fast somehow being unfair against ESL speakers largely comes from EPL men. And it's always been very interesting to me to hear EPL men tell me repeatedly that speaking fast somehow marginalizes ESL speakers, when meanwhile, the best ESL teams in the world have beat the shit out of me repeatedly by not talking fast, but deploying a variety of strategies in order to, counter both matter dumping and also other strategic choices I make in a round and other strategic choices I make in a debate. And I'm happy to discuss a lot of those strategic choices at length because there's a lot more I think that goes into what I attempt to do in debate than talking fast. And there's one thing I'd like to get out on the podcast is that there's more to what I do because I think sometimes the discourse becomes very one-sided and sort of single-focused in that regard.
To finish off the subject of speaking fast in particular, I would say I think there is, it's okay to have different opinions on whether that's a good strategy or not. In fact, there are many cases in which I disagree with you that it is the correct strategy, but it's different styles, different approaches. That's totally okay. What I will say is, though, it is a strategy rather than particular unfair advantage or whatever you want to call it, and we should look at it like this.
Mm.
So, moving on, my next question, as you've alluded to, is if we take away your fastness, what is Matt Cato, the debater, good at?
No, sounds good. And before we move on, the last thing I'll just say to sort of tie a bow on that discussion is that for the most part, I've rarely ever believed that the criticism that I get from the community is criticism in bad faith. Usually, I think it's largely good faith criticism and comes from people who care an immense amount about BP and debate, as I do. And I just, in having this segment, want to say to those people that I hear you and BP is something I value as well and care an immense amount about, both in terms of format health and things like this. And I think some of the crazier criticisms that are very pedagogical and things like this about like fast talking is bad for the format in some way, or it's going to turn BP into policy debate. just to me seem very far-fetched, but I understand where they come from. And I hope that, given it's a strategy like any other, that because BP is best when it can embrace a variety of different styles and a variety of different, subjectively good speaking. I hope that one day it can, the discourse around it can become slightly less polarized, so to speak. In terms of things that I'm good at that aren't talking fast, I think one of the breakthroughs, because I think that BP is one of those weird activities where you can do it for a while and it can, feel like you've plateaued and you're not getting better, no matter how much you practice and no matter how many tournaments you do. But once in a while, you'll have like a major breakthrough moment where suddenly you start averaging a bit higher, or you just feel like your feedback is better from judges, or you win more tournaments than you previously did. And one of those big sort of moments for me came around the time that debate was transitioning back to in person following the COVID-19 online era. So this was sort of the February 2022 in the lead up to Belgrade Worlds over the summer. And as sort of prep for Worlds, one of the things that Ahmed and I did was have calls with a variety of experienced debaters in order to generally learn how to improve over time and learn from some of the old great ones on what we could do better. And one of the people I spoke to was Milos. And Milos had a lot to say about ways we could improve at the time. But one thing he said to me that really stuck with me, at least from the start of the conversation, was that one of the advantages that ESL teams have over EPL teams is that EPL teams don't frame the way ESL teams do. And that if I was able to incorporate framing into my matter dumping style, it would make me a much stronger speaker. And Milos said to me that this was the ESL superpower, and the quote unquote EPL superpower is matter dumping. Now, we can agree or disagree with that, right? Many ESL matter dumpers out there. But he said if you combine those two together, then you will do very, very well at Worlds. You have a good shot to win. And this was something that I really took to heart. And so Ahmed and I readjusted our prep strategy to incorporate a far greater emphasis on framing than we previously had. So this would be to talk about it actively and prep far more, rather than just sort of assuming that the framing that I would come up with at the start of PM was the correct one, or the framing that Ahmed came up with in the first 5 minutes of prep was the correct one. Rather, we interrogated it. We spent extra amount of time at tournaments teasing out correct and smart strategic framings to apply to our cases. And while I don't think it's something that we are greatest of all time at or anything like this, it is something that we do consistently now in our speeches and did consistently in the lead up to Worlds. And in the combo with saying very analytically dense mechanisms, framing can be incredibly powerful at boxing out other teams preemptively, at characterizing the debate so they fight on your turf, and a whole bunch of other things that I'm sure you know very well. I'm preaching to the choir here. But applying that to my rounds, I think, was the biggest breakthrough I had in the lead up to Belgrade Worlds prep season. Second biggest, I think the biggest was when I figured out how to apply that skill to extensions, sort of a few weeks before Belgrade, and that was actually, I think, the biggest moment when I realized I could frame just as well from extension and run one argument well framed from extension with many mechs. And I think those were the two big moments, at least in the lead up, that helped me a lot. The second thing I think that I would consider myself good at is analysis. So to me, debate at its core is a game about analysis. I really enjoy that element of the game, and I really enjoy thinking of ways to analyze things. And I think that often the speeches that I'm proudest of are the speeches where I go deep on one topic and analyze it in depth, rather than the speeches where I, say a lot of arguments, even if they're well analyzed. And I think if I had to pick a skill that I'm proudest of in debate, it's probably that, because I think that being able to go in depth about arguments and being able to explain them with a degree of comparative nuance is not just an advantage in BP, but also an advantage just in terms of the value of the game as a tool you can apply to both your professional life and your day-to-day life. So those are probably the two skills that go into sort of crafting my speeches that I haven't talked as much about.
I want to get into a little bit your mentality in debating. So we need to go a little bit back. So Belgrade WDC, you guys break first, do very well. You end up becoming first speaker, best speaker in the world. What happened in that out round?
Well, this is a loaded question. Um, I'll answer to the best of my ability. I think there were a few things that happened in that out round. And to answer the question most effectively, I have to go back to the lead up to Belgrade and actually a few years before then to Cape Town Worlds, which was the worlds I did with my debate partner at Bard, Templeton. So rewinding a few years, pre-COVID, pre Matt Caito fast talking, pre all of these things. I was a debater for Bard, which is a small liberal arts school, for those who don't know, in the middle of nowhere in upstate New York. And Bard, compared to most liberal arts schools in the US, has a pretty good BP program in that we have coaches who specifically coach BP who have been fixtures in the community for a long time. And we had a number of decent debaters, some who did school, some who didn't, who came up and taught us a lot about debate. Templeton was a schoolie, and he brought that skill to his university debating career. Cape Town Worlds was a pretty big deal for us because we really wanted to be the first Bard team to break open at Worlds, and we wanted to be one of the first liberal arts schools in a while to break open at Worlds because I don't think there'd been one for a few years. The last one was Zoe Seaman Grant 2017 Bates in the final. And to make a long story short, we did not break open at Cape Town Worlds. We ended on 16 points. We lost a bubble room. That round's recorded on YouTube. You can watch it. I give not a great speech. My partner gives a slightly better speech, but it's to no avail. We fourth the round against the eventual world champions. And because you need 17 and speaks to break, while we had the speaks, we ended on 16. So we missed the break. This was really quite emotionally crushing for me because I'd invested a lot of time in improving at debate. And I also thought I was better than I was because this was before online spars, before I really had a sense of how strong the global circuit was. And I had no idea how hard a lot of the other people who had like beaten me in that round, but also who broke open at that Worlds had worked to get there. So many of the speakers there who broke at that Worlds are speakers I admire a great deal, but they just had either more resources, more time, or just did better in those rounds for whatever reason than I did. And so they deserved to be there and I didn't. But it was really emotionally quite taxing. So going into Belgrade, which was the first Worlds I had the opportunity to do again years later, when I thought I was significantly better at debate, I was quite petrified of history repeating itself. I really didn't want to lose the bubble room again. And that round had haunted me for quite some time. And because I care a lot about debate, somewhat arbitrarily, I was thinking about that round for most of Belgrade Worlds. So, like round one, for example, I was far more neurotic than I usually was because I didn't want to randomly take a third or a second early on and lose a point. And I have to be very like extend a lot of gratitude to Ahmed for keeping me sane during those rounds. I don't think we spoke poorly, but outside of debate, I was definitely a lot more stressed than I usually am. And while we did well in the preliminary rounds, the entire time I was thinking, sooner or later, our luck's going to run out. We're going to eat a couple fourths and then we're going to lose, just like Cape Town. And that didn't happen. And funnily enough, round seven, when we were in the top room, we had spent a few rounds in the top room fending off teams in kind of like a King of the Hill style, where you just knock some of the teams out and then other teams come up and they're very good and then you knock them out. And we hit round seven and we're on 16 points after the first six rounds. And we need a third and we're most likely breaking on speaks. And following that round, I was incredibly stressed because based on back tabbing, it looked like we were on either 16 points or 18 or 19 points. And I was fixating on the scenario where somehow we'd fourth the round against Rumen Alec, LACB, and Belgrade. And that was like a 1 in 500% chance, right? that we actually didn't win or that we actually were on the loss. The back tab was most likely saying we won, but I was fixated on the 1% scenario where we lost the entire time. So my mental game was not good this tournament, despite the performance being quite good objectively in rounds. And when we broke top after round nine, and having won that round, which was ironic, I was stressed we wouldn't break at all, and we were the only team that had broken for sure after round seven. Um, when we broke top, I thought, okay, we did it. Now we can go all the way. There's nothing here that we haven't done already. We've already beaten the best teams. We won the round nine top room. We can take it all the way to the finish line. Um, I think that while we rallied a lot in terms of mental game, at least I did, following the break and following the announcement, having to do another debate after that experience left me a little sloppier than I usually am. And in that round, I think we needed to modulate our style of debating far more to the panel that we had. Because up to that point, we'd been judged mostly by people who had judged me a lot online. And we'd been judged mostly by people whose judging I knew quite well. So I either made very minimal modifications to my speaking style or none at all. In that round, it required more mental energy than I was prepared to give an octofinal. What I needed to do was I needed to speak differently than the way I usually do. And I needed to think about it in a way that I wasn't quite mentally equipped to do in that moment. I'm not saying that's why we lost the round necessarily, but I do think it shaved off key percentage points. And because everything in debate is ultimately about probability and is somewhat subjective, we could have increased our odds of winning that round had I been more mentally prepared and less mentally exhausted from the in rounds. The other reason I think that we lost the round was because we were at least somewhat overconfident in that we figured we'll get through this and maybe the quarter will be a challenge. But we thought it was most likely a lock that we would get through. And it was only mid round when opening government was taking most of what I had to say that I realized we might not actually go through. And by that time, I think it was too late to course correct a bit and get ourselves out of the position we were in. And I think that had I realized initially that I was being judged by a judge I didn't know as well, that I should probably revert to best practices and speak very slowly, maybe speak a little more stylistically, things like this, I might have had a better chance of winning. But because I wasn't mentally in the place to do that, I didn't. And so I spammed a lot of arguments and lost the round.
So this is interesting. Uh, Break happens. How much time after that is the first out round?
It was the next day, right? So unlike the usual in-person worlds, they had the octofinals immediately the day after. So it was like 12 hours.
Yeah, I want to clear that up because I think it's interesting because when we broke first this year, I think one of the very good things that went in our favor was we could party a little bit, we could have fun, we could kind of then have a whole day to clear our minds, and then we start a completely new day, kind of mentally prepare ourselves and things like that. So I think yeah, that's very tough to kind of go to that emotional roller coaster, if you would say, worrying about the rounds, so kind of being low, then being very very high, and then you have to pick yourself up very fast and continue going, which is something very very tough.
And the other two teams in the round that went through, ANU and TCD Phil, did debate very well in that round. So like, I don't want to take it away from them. In that round, they were also just better. So there's also that.
Well, I mean, the mental game is part of the game.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's not about being great; it's about being okay. I think I've had out rounds like this where I just needed to be okay, and sometimes I was, sometimes I wasn't. It's I think complicated matter. So tell me about these worlds, and before you tell me the story, I want to talk really briefly about something. So Some people created a debate draft before Worlds.
I remember this.
So I mean, it's so in good fun. Like we're not gonna say who did it. I think it was generally fun
Yeah.
from my perspective. Um, so for context, debate draft means like you draft speakers based on who you think is gonna win, and you create like uh, teams of speakers, and then you kind of accumulate the points like a fantasy draft in any other sport. So uh, I believe you were a bit underrated, not too underrated, but still a bit underrated. You were definitely not the first pick on the draft. I don't think you were the second pick as well. Do you remember which pick you were?
I was third or fourth, I think, maybe fifth.
Yeah, which is kind of like interesting coming off being best picker in the world. So how did that make you feel?
Uh, It was weird. I thought I should probably be higher, but then again, I also didn't know what to do with my record after Belgrade, right? A large part of why I ended up doing Madrid was because I felt very conflicted about Belgrade. Because how do you interpret the result that we had, right? We were best team and best speaker, but then we dropped in the first out round. So it's like, I don't know what to do with that either. Maybe I'd rank myself lower. Maybe I'd rank myself higher. I don't know. So, well, obviously, subjectively, you want to believe that you should be higher on the ranking. At the same time, objectively, it's a weird one. I don't really know if there's a parallel in debating history. I know Sam Block dropped Octos one year, but I don't remember if it was the year he was best speaker in like 2008. And obviously, Ayala and Don dropped their quarterfinals very famously in Mexico the year they top broke and top spoke. But other than that, I don't think there are that many historical parallels. So I don't really blame the community for not knowing what to do with me on the draft pick either. I also think there might have been some regional and circuit implications as well. I would have liked to see a European draft and see where I placed on that.
Yeah, if people want to know the story behind Ayao and Dan going out the quarters, they should watch the Ayao episode, which by the time this up is gonna be up. So it's gonna be very, very fun times. So again, before we get to the question, another interesting thing that I want to ask you about. What is a threat matrix?
Oh my god. This is Ahmed's fancy EPL brain terminology. I don't know what it means either. What I know the threat matrix is a list of all the teams that are going to be at Worlds and Euros and their strengths and weaknesses. That's what we made. It's an Excel sheet. Ahmed labeled it threat matrix. And I went in and I was like, what's a threat matrix? And I was like, it sounds cool. And I was like, okay. He's I'm the PR man of the team, but he definitely has some degree of creative control over the branding. And so I let him have this, right?
So, what was in the threat matrix? Did it help at some points during the tournament?
Lots of secrets. I can't even remember us looking at it once, to be honest. I know. I think Ahmed had a printed out copy for Madrid, but I don't remember us looking at it even once. Largely, we chatted about. We used it as a springboard to discuss ideas in advance of the tournament. We talked about different teams when we were making the list, and we talked about strategies to attempt to beat them, but we didn't refer to it during the tournaments.
So, going into Belgrade, what was your mentality during the tournament? Obviously, the in rounds were a tougher journey, though I don't think that you did that bad at all. But still, like not first. It's uh, it did it had an impact on you, or were you like confident it doesn't matter which where I break, it's all about the out rounds?
No. That was the mentality we tried to have. In practice, is a little harder to apply. So going in, we thought we would break high, but we knew that based on variance, it wasn't likely we'd break top again. So we were hoping to achieve other goals this time. We were hoping to win or at least make it into a late out round. So we weren't too concerned about break position in and of itself. Obviously, during the tournament, it becomes more of a concern when you realize on day three you actually have to fight for the break as opposed to having the break already more or less locked up, which was the experience we had at Belgrade. So day one, we felt pretty confident with our performance. We talked to judges, every round at majors. We always ask every judge if we attempt to in person. It's a little harder to track down every panelist, but Belgrade, Worlds, and Zagreb Euros, we do our very best to talk to every judge after every round to try to get feedback on our performance. And I think anybody who's considering doing a major, this is an underrated skill that not everybody does. You want to win panels, not individual chairs. And the more you talk to judges, especially the panelists who might not think you win initially, the more insight you'll get into how to debate better. Um, so yeah, we were pretty confident. We liked our results, and we liked the feedback we were getting. Day two, we ran up against the very good Australian teams, so three Sydneys, and this was a challenge we hadn't encountered before, not in the way we did there. So we'd hit good Sydneys at Belgrade, but in the online environment, there's something very different about the way Aussies debate. They have a stylistic appeal that translates far better in person than it comes across online. By comparison, Europe looks very stylistically poor right now. The rounds that I was in with European debaters in general felt, in general, this is not every speaker I spoke against, in general, felt much less animated than the rounds I hit against Aussies through the whole tournament. This might be because they did less online debating, so maybe they preserved some pre-COVID stylistic tricks, or they were always quite stylistically good, even at the worlds I did prior to COVID. But we were not equipped in the same way to win against them with the strategies we prepared to face them online, because we'd beaten them online before. But in person, they were doing something different, and that something different was working against us. We lost to three Sydney teams on day two, and that was why we entered day three with way fewer points than we did before. And going into after day two, we were feeling a little demoralized, and we got together afterward. And I was talking to Ahmed, and we were like, we need to find a way to do better against these Sydney teams, and we need to figure out a strategy. And eventually, we just settled on going all in on, if not rhetoric, then passion in a lot of rounds. And so day three, when we ran up against the Sydneys again, we went all in on trying to be as stylistic as we can manage to be. And this means on the immortality motion, around eight, going very, very hard and talking very, very passionately about how death is like something that people fear very deeply, and going in depth about how it makes you feel, and really expressing that angst. And the moment I realized it was working in that round, by the way, was when I went off on a bit of a rhetorical rant about how immortality would like solve the existential fear of death, and saw a panelist nodding along with that. And when I saw them nodding along with a piece of analysis I never would have done in a different round, I realized we were doing the right thing. And this was what gave us an advantage, I think, against the Sydneys on day three, because we won our rounds against the Sydneys A and B on day three. And I think by playing their game and by modulating our style a bit more, we were able to recover points we otherwise might not have. We might have broken lower if we hadn't switched up our gears in time for the next round. But yeah, generally speaking, stressful for sure. It was less dreadful than Belgrade for the most part, because I think I had a lot more riding on Belgrade because I hadn't broken at Worlds before then. So I was really hoping to get the break, and then everything else was kind of, Madrid. I was more in for the long haul, so I was able to weather the in rounds with a bit more composure.
So getting into the out rounds, you perform well, you get to the semis. So obviously, like you go to the hump of previous performances. World semifinals is a big deal, and you're in a very, very tough semis. I mean, I would say every world semi is tough. It's a world semi, but for sure, it was a very tough one with a lot of teams with a lot of reputation, big skill sets, and stuff like that. So tell me about that experience, and tell me um, what was the mentality after you unfortunately lost, and how did you perceive that as w- was there some sort of like life lesson for you? Do you think that it made you look at debating in a different way? Was it important at all for you that you go to the finals, or um, tell me more about this?
Yeah. So the short answer is yeah, obviously on some level it's definitely kind of heartbreaking because every debater dreams at least once of being in the world's finals and, living that dream. And very few get the chance to make that happen. And very few even get the chance to be have that dream within reach, as close as being in the semifinals that feeds into that round. So obviously, on some level, it's quite disheartening because you feel like you put a lot into it, and to not see that rewarded is sad. It's also disheartening because of the way the round went. We felt very good about our performance. I usually have a pretty good read on when we're going to go out, and in this round, I thought we were probably okay. Most of our we had a group chat on Messenger that we would check after rounds, and it had a bunch of different debaters who I respect a great deal who were, giving us honest feedback on our performance as we went through the tournament and watching our recorded rounds, and they seemed to think we had done a good job. Um, and we're probably going to go through in their words. So I felt pretty good about that. I talked to the two teams I thought had the best chance of going through out of if not us. I talked to the two teams who I thought would likely go through, and they both seem to think that they both have themselves going through, but then us as the second team, which is usually a good sign because typically when teams have you going through with them, if they think they did a very good job, then that means you either are first or you're like very very close second to the team that's first, because maybe they don't, maybe they think they did very very well, but then they think you're the team that has the biggest chance of beating them. Oh, obviously a very good position. The motion lends itself very nicely to a very clean case. So we were pretty confident coming out of the round that we had a good chance, more confident than we were in previous Worlds Out rounds. Um, Obviously, debate is subjective, and the teams in the round that went through did a very, very good job. So we weren't surprised per se, especially since the DLib was very long. Long deliberations can be a good or bad sign, but usually it means it's at least controversial. In this case, it meant it was a very good round. They had to go through a lot of material and discuss it in depth, to figure out the comparisons. So if we were to lose, we knew it would be on a very small margin and we'd be punished for very small things. And that was indeed the feedback we got later. So yeah, it was obviously sad. But, and this is a major caveat actually, we were far less sad than we would have been to have dropped earlier in the tournament. And there was a time in the Octos of Madrid when I truly thought that was more likely to happen than not. And so my most overriding reaction when I heard that going through would be the teams on long diagonal was relief that it was in the semi rather than the octo. Because if we dropped in the octo 2 years in a row, I would have been far more upset and probably wouldn't be on this podcast right now than I was about losing the semi.
Yeah, I think for me, after the finals, after losing the finals, I truly realized by the way that I felt that it was truly not because I've made the finals, but now because the whole tournament is over and it was a generally a great experience for us. That I felt like, for me at least, it's really about the journey. And I, even back at that moment, mostly cherished the experience and not really the end result. Because I was sitting there and I was like, okay, so alternative scenario is now I have this trophy in my hands, but I still look back to the particular moments of the whole experience as the like what makes it fun for me. So I think this is like a good mentality to have going into majors, especially if you really care about it. And you have high hopes. That's obviously good. You should be competitive if you want to win, but think about what you enjoy about the process of debating. And if you don't enjoy the process of debating at all, you're probably doing it for the wrong reasons.
Yeah. I agree with that very much. And I would also add that I think that because debate has such a level of variance to it, and because at the end of the day it is subjective, right? There are objectively correct calls, but there's a wide spectrum of subjectivity that exists in debating as well. Um, I do think that being kind to yourself is important, and not being too hard on the rounds that you lose, because at the end of the day, what separates you from the one out round following is both a whole host of factors outside your control: what other teams say, what position you draw, uh, what you decide to run, how you feel in that moment, and also factors you can control, but are still, very much subject to external factors. So be kind to yourself.
I I want to move on to a more interesting topic in terms of less emotional, more for the crowd, if you know
Amazing.
what I mean. Um, the GOAT conversation in debating.
All right.
This is it's become like a bit in our show.
Yeah.
So every guest we've had, I've asked about the GOAT. What's your approach to the GOAT conversation? And of course, who is the greatest of all time?
Don Lahav or Harish Natarajan. There's no other answer. Those two are head and shoulders above every other debater. There are people who come close, but those two are objectively the correct answer, in my view. You can choose either one. I will respect either opinion, but you can't choose other people, in my view.
Why?
Two reasons. The first is, I think, in terms of both being holistically strong at debate, they check each box. They can be analytically dense, they can be rhetorically persuasive, and they can simultaneously be, good at the fundamentals of debating, good rebuttal, good framing, the checklist, so to speak, right? But more than that, I think based on the two of them, they have a factor, that intangible quality that all good debaters have, but to a larger extent. What I mean by this is that I think most very, very good teams have something interesting about them that you can just sort of either feel or that is distinct about their style. To use more modern examples, I think that a lot of the reason why people think that TCD Hist A from Euros, Jackson and Kevin have a very strong reputation in the community is because their speaking is very distinct from a lot of other speakers. When you think of them, you think state power principle, you think they're the people, you think they're the ones who pioneered the sort of Irish principle making in debating. Other speakers, obviously Tin, right? People think of Tin and they think of a whole host of things, or Milosh and Yanko for strategy and framing. All of these speakers have like some sort of defining quality about them that makes them great. Some people would say it's me and matter dumping, right? Or Naomi and matter dumping. Um, Harish and Don have that factor, but more than other debaters. And it's hard to put into words exactly why. When you watch Don use like an allegory about Schindler's List in a speech, for example, or when you watch his round about decapitation and terrorism, the round robin in 2016, right, where he's speaking with Sama, or you watch Harish even in the most recent LSE Open final, explaining the moral necessity of killing Claudius as Hamlet, you can feel the arguments they're making in a way that I think goes beyond debating as a game and crosses into the realm of holistic persuasion. That is, I find it persuasive to me, Matt Caito the human, not me, Matt Caito the judge who's playing an intellectual activity. I also just think analytically, this is something I value a lot in debating. And I've seen these speakers engage in analytic depth that I think is close to unparalleled in the game. And what I mean by this is that not only is it analytically strong in that they're checking all of the boxes, but they're drawing on examples that, if it doesn't come from their life, comes from real world experience. So when Don is talking about abandoning the strategy of decapitation and fighting terrorism, he's giving examples of when decapitation can be useful. You feel that this is real and you feel that this is visceral without it sacrificing the fundamentals of good BP debating. That for me is the reason they top the list of debate goats. I will entertain counter arguments, but that's for me what I think is the opinion I hold, and I don't think I'll change that.
So, who would you say is the most overrated debater?
Not Shangwu Li. I'm sorry, I heard the podcast with Tejas and I had to respond to this. I think that, well, I agree broadly with what Tejas is saying, which is that a lot of the arguments that Shangwu pioneered have been, iterated on and expanded by later generations of debaters. And now those arguments would probably beat the arguments made by Shangwu if they happened in 2023. I think that calling Shangwu overrated is, I don't know, a bit absurd because I had a conversation with a friend of mine, Yossi from Berlin, recently, who's been a debate mentor for me for a long time, and he was like, calling Shengwu overrated is like calling Paul Morphy overrated at chess. It's like you can't call someone overrated if they created the argument that then shaped the meta and changed the way people debate for years and years and years. They originated that style, and they would probably, iterate new arguments if they came back as well. So while I don't think he's the goat, I think that he's up there in the pantheon of all-time greats. Um, I don't know if I have an answer per se to who's the most overrated because that would require me understanding how rep works, which I think is hard to do. And before you say that's a cop-out answer, I do have things to say here. Don't worry. But I think that generally rep correlates with achievements to an extent, but also sometimes doesn't. So I'm unsure sometimes how much my own perception of people correlates with community perception. So I could say someone's overrated, someone's underrated, and I think that this is, it might be true, it might not be true, depending on how the wider community perceives things. But what I'll say is, I think that almost all good debaters now um, I think that there is less of a gap between many of the very, very good ones who get a lot of recognition and many of the lesser known, but still very good debaters today. And there's a whole conversation we could have about whether debating is better now than it was in 2016. I have thoughts on that as well. But I will say one trend I've observed, and I've debated for a long time. I've debated since 2017, and I wasn't great, but I was decent in 2017. Um, the median room has gotten a lot better. Like I have to work a lot harder to win the average room of debate than I did in 2017. In 2017, you could be in a straights room at Worlds, for example, and teams might be making 5 minute speeches, or they might be making arguments that are entirely off clash or counter propping when they're not allowed to on motion rules. Now, for a variety of reasons, you can, for better or for worse, decide whether they're good or bad. The European standard from 2017 has become the global norm, and debaters, due to the massive amount of workshop content that exists online, now all debate in a slightly more homogenous way. And in addition to debating in a more homogenous way, they also have iterated on stock arguments far more. So debaters who in 2017 might have been average or below average can now win rounds against teams that broke open very high at Euros or Worlds more consistently. And I think that what this means is that you get both punished for making small mistakes more than you used to because teams that are quote unquote bad can win rounds against you. But also that in general, the very, very good teams, there's a perception gap between teams that are less good and teams that are very good that I think is wider than it suggests. I think there are many speakers in today's game that I respect a great deal who are very, very good, but can lose to speakers who have much less rep and much less, you know, clout in the community. And I think that that recognition of that is something that could go a long way. And the reason I say that, so if you ask me who's overrated, I think broadly the top tier of debaters in 2023 against the second tier of debaters in 2023. That's not to say there aren't bad debaters in 2023. Before the boomers come for me, there's a lot we agree on as well. But that's my answer.
I think I would definitely agree to a certain extent. What I would add is I think with that also the average judge at debate tournament has definitely improved,
Oh my
uh,
God.
which I mean, especially at like a major tournament, I would say there is more judges who are capable of kind of following certain types of arguments kind of, I mean, maybe you disagree, but I genuinely think that I've even seen it like as compared with 2019 to now, where more and more there are more and more judges that I feel like um kind of, even when I don't agree with the call, it's a okay level of rationale. And of course, there's many levels of like where I've been, oh no, I don't like this call, or I don't think this OA was at all productive or whatever. But if I have to look at the whole thing, I would definitely say this is a thing I've noticed improving.
When I first started debating, my second year, where I was on the US circuit at a US major, I once had a judge give me the fourth because he didn't like POIs. Not my POIs, the concept of POIs in general. And I think I've told you the story before, but I'm telling it for the podcast. This would not happen now at most majors in the world. And I think that's generally for the best. There are a lot of other aspects, I think, that you could say, like the standardization of BP has been good for judging. I will say that one thing I think that has, if not gotten worse, then become different, is that I think while every OA in general is better, I also hear fewer OAs now that I find to be like life altering. When I was doing Cape Town Worlds, Selenivo gave me an OA round 6 or round 7. I don't remember. I can check the tab later. But that OA was like life changing for me. Like it genuinely opened new pathways in my brain to think about debate in ways I'd never done before. I haven't heard an OA like that in a while. And that is no slight really against any judges today. It might just be that now that I've done more debate, I might be learning less from each OA. But I think that what's happened to judging is similar to what's happened to debating in a sense, wherein the floor has gotten very, very good. But there are definitely some aspects of the game. There's certain aspects of the game that we've lost as well, as the game has become more homogenous and more standardized.
Well, I have to ask which aspects.
Absolutely. I think that there are fewer new arguments run now. Teams feel less of a willingness to take chances on running something that's unique. And what I mean by this is that on one hand, it's great that we have so much excellent workshop material out there on how to do stock analysis well. But I think that to a large extent, teams play it safe more than they should. Debate is a dialectic activity, right? It evolves as people do it and as speakers come and go and they redefine metas that they're in. That is the expected pool of arguments you face at every tournament, right? I didn't know what meta meant either for a long time. I had to look it up when people started using it on serious posting. But the problem, I think, to an extent, with a lot of modern argumentation is that it follows very predictable pathways. And this is good for me, especially because it makes it easier to make a variety of arguments with fewer words. Because if an argument is already embedded in people's minds, then there's not too much you have to do in terms of analytical rigor to convince them it's true. But it's bad for, I think, the game, because I think that BP is a game that depends on analysis and analysis being done and made objectively within the round that happens. And I think the more shorthands we develop for arguments and the more homogenous the arguments become, the less intellectual depth the game has. And so I'd like to see very good speakers take more risks running arguments that they think might not work. We tried to do this, Ahmed and I, to no success in the Cambridge IB final this year. It's recorded. We tried to run a principle we'd not run before. We were CO and we thought about running a similar case to the one that Syria and MDG ran in the Euros round, because it's the same motion about Iran acid attacks, eye for an eye principle. But we ended up trying to run something different. It didn't work out because we ran the principle poorly. But I'm glad we tried, because we were genuinely striving for something that we hadn't heard run before in a debate, to try something new, rather than just like analytically extend you and Rumen on backlash or run the stock principle that responds to the OG principle. There are other speakers who I think attempt to do this a lot. I know that people have opinions on TCD Phil A, but I think that they often push boundaries in debate with the arguments they run. And I think that that's a good thing overall, because I think that what it does is, even if those arguments lose, or should lose sometimes, they open the game up to more people trying to iterate and improve on those arguments in the future. And they make the game more deep and they add more enjoyment to the game. Because when I hear an argument I haven't heard run before, it makes me more interested and invested in debate. And it makes me want to keep coming back to the activity.
I absolutely agree. What I would say here is it it starts with the way that you approach building cases. So I think me and Roman are very different in that way, but I am not a debate nerd per se in terms of knowing a bunch of debates and remembering a bunch of analysis and things like that. I always intuitively, for me, it's not very hard because maybe I'm lazy and I forget, I don't know, but I generally just approach every round with the same uh, concept that I would approach any debate, which is just think about the big picture, think about trade-offs, etc., etc. But what I'm trying to convey is I never think of, oh, this is what we can run. There's this argument or that argument. I don't think about arguments that I've run before in terms of other people that may have run before as well. So I think just if you generally have that approach, it's going to make you a better debater, even if you're not actively trying to make original arguments. At some point you adopt certain level of original thought if you are essentially just thinking about the issues at hand rather than saying stuff that you've heard other people say. Or at least if you are doing that, make sure that you understand them beforehand, and it will inevitably mean that you add a little bit of your own perspective on on these issues. So I don't know if for me, I don't know if I'm the most original debater in terms of actual arguments and analysis, but I definitely think I'm original in the ways that I explain certain types of arguments, which I think is also another layer of what you're trying to say, and I think can also improve the game on its own. So sometimes, because I wanna point this out, what you're saying is correct, but it's some part of it is because I think we've gone to a point where a lot of the motions that we've seen, we've kind of seen them, and it's harder, it's becoming harder and harder to think of absolutely original motions that you can't run some of the old stock arguments. So just like the uh, uh, because we've talked about a bunch of stuff and a lot of it's recorded, the very good debaters who know a lot of stuff and who've done hours and hours of prep know a bunch of these arguments, and that's normal. But I think at that point, it's also important to put your own style into the argument itself. And I think that that's also another aspect of kind of making the game more fun and more original. But I will echo definitely what you're saying about TCD feel, because um, I think I don't I'm not sure if I'm smart enough to to run some of the things they're saying. Sometimes I feel like I'm smarter because I'm not running the things that they're saying. But it's definitely a pleasure to have them in the community. We need more of these teams, and I think that these are the teams that can kickstart more and more people to uh, approach their own originality, their own versions of originality in debating, which I think is what it's all about. I think just at the moment the problem is a lot of people are afraid to do it because they don't feel comfortable enough with their style of debating or the things that they're coming up, and they're relying more on what other people who are perceived to be better are are doing some of these things. And this is why, like, when we talk about overrated debaters or not so overrated debaters, uh, wow, it's in essence just to create some controversy to make it fun. I think it's good to kind of bring down to words a lot of legends that we have in our community in order to understand that it's all about just doing your own best version of yourself.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And I also think that people shouldn't be afraid to lose. You take tournaments to experiment, with stylistic things you're not as comfortable with. Something I did a lot during prep season was just experiment with, this tournament I'll focus more on framing, or this tournament I'll only use, one paper as opposed to many, many notes, or this tournament I'll focus on running one argument. And these prep tournaments can also be good times for debaters to try out new arguments as well. Maybe they work, maybe they don't. Um, and I think that I have a respect, even if I don't agree strategically with many of the choices that these teams make. I have a respect for teams that are willing to go hard and go all out with their own unique style, even when I think it's batshit insane. So, at the very least, if you do that in a round with me, I might be confused, but I will also respect the choice.
If you had to choose one partner to win Worlds with, and Ahmed is not available at that particular time, and it's your last option to do it, who would you choose?
Modern day, probably Jackson it. Historically, I mean, if it's a cop out to say Harish, I would say Harish. I have to pick somebody else and be interesting. Maybe Vinu from Heart House.
Why?
Um, all of the speakers I've named are second speakers who can, I think, complement my style reasonably well. And what I mean by this is, well, more than reasonably well, right? These are people who are in contention for very very high praise in the debating community. Um, I think what I benefit the most from in a second is someone who can distill a lot of complex ideas into something digestible while at the same time responding to other teams. Something that Ahmed and I did very, very well in our best rounds, excuse me, is we got into a rhythm where I would be able to say a lot of matter and say it reasonably well, analyze it to completion. And then he would distill the key points of that and spin it into a story or a narrative that judges are able to internalize. So all of the mechanistic arguments are made to completion in my speech, and then the narrative is something that comes in the second. That is the story that the case is telling, whether it's told through examples or told through persuasively, illustrated mechanisms, or it's told through responses. Having a narrative, I think, is really key to cases. And the speakers I highlighted here are speakers who do a very good job at telling a story. They're not necessarily the speakers who are, going to mech the way I do, because I think that that's somewhat redundant on a team with me already. Although I did have a lot of fun, the three tournaments I did with Naomi. Our back halves did not, but we had a lot of fun. But I think it's somewhat redundant to have another matter dumper on the team. But a second that can really turn it into a narrative is one that I think I would work very well with. You can also add Milos and Yanko to this list as well. I also think we'd make a very good team. Speakers who tell stories or can, take what I've said, choose a facet of it, and then make that a narrative. Are speakers I'd probably do very well with. Another pick, because I suppose I have so many of them to just illustrate this, is I think I'd work quite well with Harry Elliott, Stanford A in the Mexico Worlds Finals, but probably not so much with Bobby, his partner, who's excellent, very, very good speaker, but is a speaker who does similar stylistic stuff to me, matter dumping, talking somewhat quickly, things like this.
Who have been your greatest rivals or people who you really wanted to beat?
Well, when I started out in online debating, and I believe I've had this conversation with you and Rumen before, uh, I was speaking online almost every weekend during COVID. I had a job I really didn't like, and debate was an escape. And I really wanted to go back to university, and debate kept me feeling young, so to speak. And every online tournament without fail, you would win your first 2 rounds, you'd get to round 3, and Tin was waiting there. Whoever Tin was with, it didn't necessarily matter, but he was with someone, and he was going to speak on Zoom or Mixid or something else and ruin your entire day by taking your case apart. And Ruben and I started calling it the tin tax because we were like, okay, we'll get to the top room and then we'll pay the tin tax and then we'll win our next one when we go down and then we'll pay the tin tax again and then we'll break and then we'll lose the finals to tin. This happened more times than I can count. So for a long time in online debating, my goal was to beat tin. And when that started to happen more frequently, I think that that was probably a moment where I felt that I had, I think, grown a lot as a debater. And I think that was the moment when I started realizing that I was not terrible. I was good on objective metrics as opposed to just, your friends telling you you're good to hype you up and things like this. That was one of the moments. Other teams that I've had friendly rivalries with. I mean, probably most like recently would be we hit TCD Phil in like 5 rounds at Worlds. And I don't know how to feel how that rivalry was settled because we won more of the rounds in the in rounds, but they won the bubble and broke above us. But then they got knocked out in the quarters before we had a chance to finish our rivalry. So it ended inconclusively. And I think we're both sad about it because we both would have liked to have been in the finals that year. I will tell you a story very quickly about a time that I felt very desperate to beat a certain team of Bulgarians in an LSE Open round online from a few years ago, where they ran a case from CO and on a motion that I thought was slightly up heavy about I think it was about like boycotts and whether or not they're like legitimate of companies. And of course, this was you and Rumen, and you beat us. I was speaking with Gwen from Bard at the time, and we were OG. And I remember being so angry. I was like, I need to win next time. I need to beat them. And I think we've had a very healthy, fun rivalry throughout the online era. Boston versus Lakers, indeed. And my one regret, I think, bigger than most everything that we didn't achieve in Madrid was that we didn't get to be on the final stage with you because I feel like that would have been the final moment of the rivalry. We're gonna duke it out one more time on the world's final stage, and we'll have to find another chance to conclusively settle the question.
Absolutely, I think that was one of my greatest regrets as well. That not only that we didn't meet in the final, but we didn't meet at all at Worlds.
No,
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 no rounds, nothing, which I mean worked out for us
yeah,
in the end. But I would definitely wanted to meet again. Of course, at Euros it was a little bit more fun because of that and the trash talking, but also like kind of after uh, after you've been in a stressful final of a major such as Euros or Worlds, if you did it with people you consider friends, it's so much better.
no,
It's so
no. I
much
agree.
better, and yeah. But again, this again has become a wholesome podcast. What are we doing, Matt?
I know, I
We
know.
need to get more
Jesus.
spicy. We need
We
to
need
get
we
more
need we
spicy.
we need to channel our inner hater. But no, one more wholesome story very quick about that Euros. Do you remember round 8, the round about the high representative for Bosnia, where we drew opposition on the best
Yeah,
op motion of all time? I remember after the round, Rumen looked very down about how the round had gone and was like, "We lost," and you were like, "What are you talking about, man? We won." And when I saw you having this interaction, I felt so much sympathy for Rumen because this is me and Ahmed every round. I was like, every round of Worlds or Euros, I would be like, we probably lost, or maybe we lost. And I would be like, no, what are you talking about? We're great. And you were Ahmed and Rumen was me, and I felt a lot of sympathy. So I remember I went up to Rumen and I was like, no, you definitely won. It's okay. And then in the back tab, I remember we saw that you had indeed won. He came up to me and was like, thank you. And I was like, yeah, no, of course. And then he was like, go get him this round. And then the next round we won, and we were in the top room with you again. And Rumen and you were there to like cheer us on before the round. And I thought that was so wholesome. And I was like, this is great because I think majors are so stressful. And when you're like 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 rounds in, they become all that you care about in the moment, even if you have a healthy and well-rounded life otherwise. And when you're tunnel visioning so hard on the trophy, it's really nice to take a step back and remember the people you're going to try to, beat the shit out of in the round rhetorically are your good friends outside.
And it always makes for more fun rounds.
Yeah.
Calling each other out. I mean, maybe sometimes I've been a little harsh on my side as well. Uh,
Mm,
yeah, I remember a certain semifinals of was it Cambridge? I think. Yeah,
Cambridge, yeah, Cambridge, yeah.
Cambridge.
Nikki called, yeah, you called Ahmed overrated.
Yeah, I might have did that. Well, I mean, it was just generally very fun because I know like you guys are not gonna take it the wrong way, so I can
No,
like because I mean, if I had to actually analyze this, um, in high stressful situations, being able to say fuck to someone or do like some banter, it's actually distresses you in the speech itself also, and it
no,
kind of in
absolutely.
the round itself. So being able to do that with somebody who you know they're not gonna be like, how could you say this? We're not friends anymore. Is a great pleasure, and it makes the activity even more fun, which is kind of like what it's all about. Um, so I mean, yeah, I think we've become very wholesome to that perspective, and what can I say? Like become friends with people in the debating community. It pays off. It
Yeah.
makes it much better. And I think like our friendship is also like based on a lot of kind of competitive respect,
Yeah.
which is uh, a very good thing to have as well.
I think we fundamentally value a lot of the same things about the game, both in terms of like we care a lot of both about, the debating as an art, right? Like what I mean by this is we care a lot about debating as a analytical game where you're, through that analysis, doing more than just, giving a speech. It's like something that, feels very, almost profound in the moment because it's a really genuinely uh unique competitive experience that very little else compares to. But also, I think we care about similar things in debating as well. Like we care about both being intellectually honest, not strawmanning, engaging in good faith, attempting to always, take the arguments at their best, engaging on like every small trade off in a way that is strategic. And I think that these are things that not everybody values in debate as much as you and Roman do. And so it's been a pleasure chatting shit with you constantly for the past like three majors in our Facebook group chat.
I I I was gonna ask more questions, but I think this is a great time to kind of top it off because it has become unexpectedly wholesome. But I think in the place of different episodes that we make on the show, this is gonna be a special one, which we can like kind of look back to, look forward to. So maybe we'll have other conversations. But yeah, I think this is a great moment to kind of top it off. And of course, at the end of every podcast, what I like to do is give you how much time you need to talk about something. Um, there's really one question I want to ask everyone. If you can change something about debating, what it will be. Obviously, apart from like equity stuff and so forth, the way that we actually approach our community.
Yeah. Um, I think that I mean, I guess two answers, right? The first is I could go on a long time about different judging trends that I like or dislike. But I think that one thing I would say is that I think that in general, I think that people's approach to debating could genuinely be um, a bit more wholesome. And what I mean by this is I think that people often tend to approach things, and I think some of it is healthy, right? You want to cathartically vent about other teams, and you want to, complain and bitch about a judge, and I think all that's fair, and I think that that's something I do probably more than others. But I think that there should be an assumption of good faith more often that exists generally. That is that a judge doesn't mean to screw you over with a call you don't like or disagree with. They're doing the best they can. And I think that more people should approach debate from that standpoint first and, apply the principle of charity a little more universally. I think is probably the thing I would say. I don't think it's an equity thing necessarily. I think it's not, I don't think it's inequitable to bitch about a judge. I do it all the time. But I think in general, the community would be better served if it approached things from a standpoint of like, maybe that call isn't as bad as I thought it was, and you do yourself a disservice by not taking that into account. Even if you think a judge is really really wrong, for example, or if you think that a speaker is really really bad and didn't deserve to win against you, if you're not able to analyze critically about what they're doing well or what they're doing differently or why they're persuasive to a judge or why that argument persuaded a judge, you're going to win less than you otherwise would do. And so I think that both for your own self improvement as in the community, and also for just making the community even more of a wholesome place than it already is, that's something I would probably attempt to change. The other thing is less explicit weighing to front half. We talked about it earlier, but I think that this is a big problem with judging now. An argument can be more holistically persuasive on if from back half, even if they don't rebut their opening. In fact, rebutting your opening should go away. It was better in 2017 when people didn't do that. Those are the two things.
At the end, this is a platform as any other. You can use it by saying anything. So, what would you do? What you want to say? Maybe call out something, maybe promote something. It's your time.
I don't have much to say, but come to the Erasmus Rotterdam Open on the 5th to the 7th of May. It's going to be really fun. Me and Chris and Lucy are on cap, and it should be a good time. If you like the kinds of motions I set, you should show up. It'll be fun. There, I did my duty, Giannis. I plugged it on the podcast, the biggest debating podcast in the world. So the convener asked me to plug this tournament as much as I could. So I plugged it here. There you go.
I like how you say the biggest debating podcast in the world. Maybe
You're the
maybe
Joe
that's
Rogan of debate. It's you.
we'll see about that. We'll see about that. Well, yeah, thank you everyone who's been watching. Please do the usual stuff. Just I want to get the chance to show up on your feed, and then you can decide if you want to watch it. But who wouldn't want to watch the wholesomest conversation with Matt Caito, best speaker of the world, and a friend?
Thanks, Nikki.